everybody on the Facebook land and the Zoom webinar land. Brennan and I were so eager to start this new study that we logged in probably the earliest we've ever logged in, 1 minute early start time for office hours. It's incredible. And we are glad to be with you this morning. This is the first of a 7-week study devoted to Lent. And really, we heard a little chatter about, people wanting to do some prep work, and you guys are great students like that. But really, this is just to sort of orient folks to the study and to what we have planned for the next 6 weeks, right, Brennan?
Yes, that's right. So we started office hours last year in response to COVID and the displacement that many people felt, the strain that many pastors were under to provide lots of different kinds of education, preaching, teaching, pastoral care, all online. So we are both scholars, biblical scholars. So we're going to run this Bible study here in the way that we ran it last year. We'll have guests on sometimes we won't. We asked a lot of people to join us, but as you might know, it's been a busy year. And it's also been a busy year, especially for academics who have had to kind of turn over all of their teaching and techniques and everything else and learn a whole new bag of tricks teaching online and changing all of their syllabi and things like this. So everyone's tired right now. So Chris and I will have some guests sometimes. I believe Beverly Gaventa will be with us during this study.
She's making an encore appearance on March the 28th. And what's awesome about Beverly Gaventa is joining us again is we'll be talking about Romans 12 there. And she is currently writing a commentary on Romans and is reworking her material from chapter 12. So we are guaranteed to get like the freshest of the fresh reflections there. And I think, Brennan, that she's really interested because there's some references to Proverbs in chapter 12 that she wants to explore with you. We also have a friend of yours who I know of through scholarship, but somebody you know better, Matthew Tyson. Yes. Where's Matthew these days?
Matthew's in McMaster in Canada, but he's did his PhD at Duke, and he has taught in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, a very tropical climate. You might
very
realize
warm
from near the Arctic Circle. But he's from Canada, so it's he's kind of back home, I think in Ontario. But he has written a really fantastic book actually that I've gotten right here called the Jesus and the Forces of Death, and this was in a way one of the inspirations for this approach to Lent that we're going to get to in just a minute. Some of the readings here from this book and other readings we've got in a kind of a syllabus that we can post. And also, Chris, where can they get access to these materials and readings and resources if they want to join in that part of the study? By the way, you don't have to do any of these readings or anything like this to join with us, but you're very welcome to. But Chris, where would they want to find these further materials if they wanted to find them?
Yeah, so that's great. So we started using a platform called Mighty Networks back in December. If y'all will remember the study of Mary, we put some of the additional resources there for the office hour study. And we'll use that again for this Lent course. And it's a free service to anybody who wants it. It just requires an email and a password. And for my purposes, this is what protects us at some level in our ability to share resources that are published in articles or in book chapters. And so it's different than just like putting the information out on the public internet. But we posted this morning the link to join that course on Facebook. We'll repost it again, maybe as a comment to the video on YouTube. And I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what to expect with this course site, since we sort of introduced it last week, last study, but we never really gave an orientation to it. So this is what you'll see when you join the class. It will seem very familiar to anybody that has done an online class. The Mighty Network feels kind of like Facebook or a learning management system. And so here is, just the description. And then you'll see there's course material, and this will be built out in the next few days. But you'll see, each week there will be material posted, and you can see, we have a suggested primary reading as well as some secondary readings. And then any of the PDFs that we're offering will be just right there, easy for you to download and read. And the really cool thing about this network is it does give you the opportunity to talk with each other. There's a chat feature. So if you want to say, hey, I read this thing and it really was really great, you can post that way. So it is both an opportunity to share content and to continue to develop this office hours community that we have enjoyed seeing grow over the last year. And so if you have any questions about this, I'm sort of got the wheel on it at First Press. And so I'm happy to answer any questions. But again, anybody can join. You can invite your church members to join. You can invite your friends to join, and it will be a great community. And you'll learn about other cool opportunities that are going on at First Press if you're interested in that sort of stuff. But
great.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, thanks, Chris. Yeah. And we are also working on a website to be able to put up our studies for office hours. That's in the works. With Julie Bailey from Columbia Theological Seminary is helping us with that. So we're really excited to get that going too. So, but about this study, Chris, what are we doing here? What is our topic for Lent?
Yeah. So I think, as you and I were talking, we talked about some different ideas, but I would say the sentiment that was most clear is that if we associate Lent with like a rigorous discipline and like giving up things, and like if we think about it as not like fun, many of us would say we've been there probably since mid-March of 2020. We've experienced an absence of relationships. We've experienced sort of a destabilizing of our routines. And so we wanted to do something for Lent that still intersected with the themes of Lent, but maybe took a different approach than, let's just give up things, or let's, I'm not going to eat chocolate. And we could do that. We could talk about not eating chocolate every week for 7 weeks.
Uh-huh.
I don't think anybody would enjoy that.
Right.
But so we wanted to take a sort of a fresh approach to Lent, and really looking at the ways in which the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus not only sort of compels us into the wilderness, but maybe even meets us in the wilderness, and thinking about the significance of particularly the cross as it relates to things like evil and the forces of death, which is something that Matt Tyson will talk to us about, as well as then some calls to repentance and other things. So it'll sort of be a mishmash of Jesus's life, Jesus's the cross and the resurrection, but it's sort of all with the idea of Lent. And so lots of New Testament passages, of course, some stuff from the Old Testament as well, and hopefully a lot of really good conversation along the way.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think you're, I identify with the, I've got kind of a checkered past in terms of denominations. I grew up quasi-Catholic. I was baptized Catholic. My parents went to Catholic church for a while, but then we didn't go to church for a long time. We went to evangelical churches sometimes. I wasn't in church for quite some time. I joined a Presbyterian church in high school at the very end of my high school years, and then I started going to Episcopal churches in college. So I've been kind of all over the map, liturgically, denominationally, but I've one consistent thing that I've seen in the liturgical denominations I've been a part of, Catholic and Anglican or Episcopalian, is this kind of interest in Lent. In the Reformed churches I've been a part of, there's been this kind of disinterest in Lent, or at least like suspicion of it, right? And I get it because in some of my church communities I've been a part of that are more high church, Lent has been about, you're right, getting, don't eat chocolate, don't eat fish, don't eat meat on Fridays. That was something that I remember, but I often don't remember kind of getting into it beyond just this idea of penance or abstinence or asceticism, right? Trying to get away from some of the pleasures of the world or something. We know, and I actually looked into it because I didn't know the history of Lent very well. So I looked into it a bit. It's got a kind of a shadowy past, but there was a 40-day fast that we know about, but we don't know exactly when it happened, sometime before Easter in the very early church. And then sometime after the Council of Nicaea, like the year 325, when a lot of church practices were beginning to get kind of regulated in some ways, and different traditions were being established throughout the church. That's when this 40-day fast for Lent began, really throughout many parts of the church that hadn't seen it before. But the idea, I think, is that it's 40 days for us to prepare, right? To prepare for the miracle of Easter. If we don't want to just kind of wake up on Easter Sunday and not have thought about it much before then, because then it'll be just a day like any other day. But one of the things that I'm interested in too is this kind of a church tradition that links the 40 days of Lent with these 40 days of wilderness wanderings that happen in the Bible. And those wilderness wanderings, like Jesus in the wilderness during his temptation, like Moses, spending 40 days on the mountain at Sinai in Exodus, or like Elijah spending 40 days on a journey to Sinai in 1 Kings 19. These kind of 40 days in the wilderness themes are often linked to questions about evil and death and life, kind of big ideas. And I have long, really in a weird way, liked Ash Wednesday. One of my favorite liturgical days of the year, ever since I was in high school, just because I felt like someone was telling me the unvarnished truth. You walk up and you get the ashes, which is a very ancient part of the ceremony, and they tell you you're gonna die someday, and then that kind of unvarnished truth that you are mortal and so on. There was something kind of, I don't know, bracing about it for me, and I still really enjoy is not the right word, but it seems like an important day of truth telling. And an important day to kind of be honest to ourselves about who we are, and what we are creatures, that we aren't infinite and eternal in and of ourselves, but that God has endowed us with everything that we have. It's a day to make me radically grateful. So anyway, that's my engagement with Lent. But I also, in reading some of this, some recent work that's been published in Old Testament studies and in New Testament studies, I've had this really, it has transformed the way that I've thought about evil, about death, about Jesus's ministry, about who God is and how God works, in relation, especially to evil and so on. And but also it just, there's this there's something important, I think, that is just now happening in biblical studies that I think speaks to the kind of world that we live in right now, and the kind of struggles that we're undergoing at the moment. I mean, I don't think anyone needs to be told, withhold some pleasures from yourself right now. Maybe some people do, but most of us have withheld a lot of pleasures over this last year, hugging friends and neighbors, our kids and grandkids, and being kind of distanced from people, distanced from our church communities, distanced from many of the things that we enjoy doing together or outside, or in restaurants. And a lot of people have foregone weddings and anniversary celebrations with families, and so all to say, like, there's so much that we've given up over this past year. Is there another way we can think about Lent that would be spiritually edifying? And I think that there is. So that's what we'll be getting into this time. But what about you, Chris?
Well, and I love the focus on, we're going to talk this morning a lot about wilderness. We're going to go deeper in just a few minutes in the Old Testament, and then we're going to talk about Jesus's temptation in the wilderness. But if we think about this, what you said, that Lent really originates in this connection with Israel's wandering in the wilderness, Jesus's 40 days in the wilderness. And if we think about Lent and wilderness, then wilderness becomes an opportunity for us to reflect not only on our humanity, like our limitedness, as you pointed out in Ash Wednesday, but also the gift of life. Also, to think about both the hope of resurrection and the new life that resurrection promises, but also the fact that the wilderness is also a barren place. And it's also, at least in the ministry of Jesus, a place where he encounters demons, where he encounters temptation, where he encounters hardship. And so in many ways, we're a wilderness people after COVID, and we could argue that the Bible is almost consistent in imagining the people of God as always on the journey, always a wilderness people. But certainly for this season in our collective cultural life, looking to the wilderness and seeing the ways in which Jesus both beckons us into the wilderness, finds us in the wilderness, accompanies us into the wilderness. I think all of that is a really important place to start and study as we continue to think about what does it mean to be Christians in this time period? What does it mean to celebrate Lent and to prepare ourselves for the hope of resurrection and the new life that Jesus is beckoning us towards in new and in small and large ways.
Yeah, and I think one other benefit of this is, the way that we have, especially Protestants, have typically thought about the death and resurrection of Jesus is with a particular kind of theory, right? Substitutionary atonement theory, that I've committed all these sins and that Jesus dies to take away those sins. Now, one of the things about the Bible that when we start digging into the Bible, especially the New Testament, you start to see that there's not just one kind of atonement theory. That is, that the cross isn't just about one thing. There's lots of different ways that the biblical authors talk about the cross, a lot of different metaphors that they use to talk about what happens at the cross. What the study is going to do, I think, is expand some of our notions of what Jesus does on the cross in time for Good Friday and Easter, for us to kind of, to help us think and live through Easter in a new way this year.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the unfortunate sort of consequence of that way of thinking is it makes sin and salvation only individualistic, and I think that our study is going to open up the ways in which Jesus's cross intersects with much larger realities like powers and principalities, or even the demonic, or even the power of death. The Matt Tyson's book title. But also, the Apostle Paul, kind of speaks to the reality of death. He talks in Romans 5 about death ruling, that death has a rule over humanity, and that ultimately grace is introduced in order to counteract that rule and counterbalance that rule. And so, again, not to say that there isn't any value to that traditional substitutionary atonement theory, but it's not the only one, and so we will sort of explore other options in our study this week, or these 6 or 7 weeks.
Cool.
So let's go back to the Old Testament, back to the wilderness. In many ways, the wilderness is an important theme throughout the Bible, whether we think about Israel, or we think about John the Baptist, if we think about Jesus, there's references to the wilderness everywhere. But I think the first thing to know, Fred Wise was wondering if you were in a hallway, and I want to point out that you're not in a hallway.
I'm also not in my home.
You're not in your home. You're in Brevard, North Carolina, in the woods. And so sometimes when we hear wilderness, we think like, oh, cool, like Israel was out on a camping trip and they were doing some, trust falls and hiking and stuff. But glamping. That's not quite what the wilderness means in the biblical tradition, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm actually in one of the few spaces at this. It's a small cabin that we're staying in. My kids are out of school this week, so we're having fun on the road while we can. But in any event, so this is actually the corner of a bedroom. So in any event, too many doors. I've even got a little escape hatch up there if I need it. It's a lot of doors. So in any event, but yes. So the wilderness, it's not glamping, right? It's not. There's no yurts out in the wilderness, but the wilderness in ancient thought, and again, I say this often, but I think it bears repeating. Ancient Israel is an ancient Near Eastern people. They're not a modern American people. They come from the peoples of the ancient Near East. Some of them come from Egypt, as Exodus chapter 12 says. Some of them come from Syria. Some of them come from Mesopotamia, like Abraham and Sarah. Some of them come from Canaan, like Caleb, who is actually from the land of Canaan, or a lot of people who kind of come from the nearby peoples and join with Israel. Israel is an amalgamation of the peoples of the ancient Near East, and so they bring with them their traditions. They understand God in a new way, in a different way from other ancient peoples, but still they come with their entire life experience and cultural experience immersed in the ancient world. And in the ancient world, the wilderness is not a good place. It's a bad place, right? So in the ancient Near East, if you're thinking from like Egypt all the way through to like ancient Persia, right, that kind of part of the world, there's not a lot of water. When there is water, there are big rivers, but if you go away from those rivers, you are in wilderness area, scrub area. I don't know if any of you have been to Israel, if you've been to Palestine, if you've seen the kind of hills and scrub areas, they're difficult to live in. There's not a lot of water present. It's harsh temperatures. There'll be high temperatures in the day, low temperatures at night. Sometimes they'll get icy in the wintertime, burning hot in the summertime. So it's not a space that's easy to live in. And in the ancient world, if you kind of went wandering into the wilderness, you were asking for death. And in fact, one important thing about ancient peoples is that every ancient people that we know of, besides ancient Israel, at least to some degree, I say to some degree because ancient Israel argued with itself about this a lot, but they were polytheistic. People had lots of different gods that they believed in, and there were high gods, kind of important gods that lived in cities and had temples that were basically their houses that they would live in, these gods, in the cult statues that would symbolize their living in the midst of this big city. And that's where the gods wanted to be. In the ancient way of thinking about the world, the gods depended on people to farm for them, to bring their food. That's what the tributes were, right? That's what they would come and give their food, and the gods would eat it. Really, the priests, but priests didn't let people know about that. But in any event, if there was a god living in a wilderness space, that would be assumed to be a demon in the ancient world. So in the ancient world, people believed in gods and demons, but they didn't believe them like we believe in, or we think about demons today. We think about demons as being 100% evil, fully associated with like the embodiment of evil, the devil or Satan or something. We're going to get to this in a
horror movies and Halloween, right? I mean, that's
right, exactly, yes. So slasher movies and things, the horror movies. But that, in fact, in the ancient world, that's not how people believed. And we're going to get to this more in a couple of weeks when we talk about evil. But for the meantime, just suffice to say that people in the ancient world thought demons were like tricksters, a little bit more like in the Thor stories about like Loki. He could be good, he could be bad, he could be out for himself. They were tricksters. So when we think about demons in the ancient world, the way that the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Canaanites, these people would talk about demons as gods that lived sometimes in the wilderness, but they lived for themselves according to their own rules, and they would try to destabilize the cities sometimes or take things for themselves. It was, they were kind of out for themselves, and they liked to cause chaos and disorder. So if you said to someone in the ancient world, I'm going into the wilderness to worship my God, they would assume you were talking about a demon. And people did worship demons in the ancient world and the high gods. They would give food to the demons, sacrifice to them, so that they would stay away from them. Like, basically, don't mess with me, right? I'll give you something to kind of pay you off, a bit like the mafia. You kind of pay a little bit, protection money. It was a bit of a protection scheme. But I want to read you this from Exodus. So when Moses goes to Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 5, Moses goes to Pharaoh, and he asks something, right? In chapter 5, this is near the beginning of the story. God tells Moses, go talk to Pharaoh. I'll bring the people out. So Moses goes and talks to Pharaoh. So Exodus chapter 5. Afterwards, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. So they're giving God Yahweh's words. So this is Yahweh, the God of Israel. Remember, Pharaoh doesn't know Yahweh, this particular God of Israel. Whenever it says Lord in all capital letters, that means Yahweh, right? The very specific name of this very specific God that we actually know about from very ancient Egyptian sources, and was a god of the nomadic peoples, these ancient Egyptians said. So the God of Israel, let my people go so they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said, I don't know this Yahweh, and I don't want to let you go in the wilderness to celebrate a festival. And so then they said, verse 3, the God of the Hebrews has revealed himself to us. Let us go 3 days journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to Yahweh our God, or he will fall upon us with pestilence and the sword. And Pharaoh says, oh no. So that is to say, if you said, I want to go worship a pestilence deity in the wilderness, who's associated with nomads, Semitic nomads, Hebrews. They would, this would have been seen as like kind of wanting to offer sacrifices to a demon. That's how Pharaoh would have seen this, which might be why Pharaoh is so reticent to say, well, Yahweh's not the God of the universe, surely, right? Yahweh's the God of a pitiful people, and is probably a demon. And Yahweh does want to kind of undo Egypt in a way, right? The powerful structure of Egypt, which is kind of what a chaos monster would do. So all to say, Yahweh looks like a chaos monster or a demon to these folks in the ancient world. But the wilderness is then associated with these spaces of danger, powerful forces that are outside the control and predictability of the major cities and so on, forces of nature that are unpredictable. But also in ancient Israel, strangely enough, these spaces are also associated with Yahweh. That is their particular God. Yahweh lives on Sinai, which is a mountain in the middle of nowhere. It's desert. You're going to die if you try to hang out there. Yahweh is the God of these desert spaces. And even when they try to build a temple for Yahweh in 2 Samuel 7, David says to Nathan, I want to build a temple. If you read 2 Samuel 7, Yahweh says, I don't really want a temple, a nice little palace. I like living in a tent. I kind of prefer the tent thing, right? And Yahweh ends up getting into the temple, but the temple always feels like the space where Yahweh's a bit uncomfortable. Yahweh likes the wilderness spaces. And I have one last really weird biblical text to share with you. And this is Judges 5. And there's a few other texts. Yeah, there's a few other texts in this that say the same thing. One's Habakkuk 3. There's another one in Psalms, but I'll just show you this one for now. Judges 5, the song of Deborah. So Deborah was a prophet. And she reigned over Israel, or kind of rule, in the time of the judges. She was the judge. She was a judge, that is a ruler of Israel, and she was a prophet, and she led them in war with Barak, with the general Barak. So chapter 5, Deborah sings her song, this is a very ancient bit of the Bible. It's written in a very ancient style. And one of the things is that the tribes don't match. There's a list of tribes in this that seems very ancient and old and unusual. But one amazing thing about this is verse 4, at the beginning, she's talking about her God, Yahweh. Deborah's singing, and they've won a victory, right? In Israel. They live in Israel now. And she's singing about her God. And if you have a God, you assume that God lives with you in the ancient world. Like all the Babylonians would say, Marduk lives with us. All of the Egyptians would say, Osiris hangs out here, or his dead body does, right? With the Egyptian traditions, or Isis lives here. But chapter 5 of Judges, Deborah sings a song of victory. And she says, Yahweh, in verse 4, Yahweh, or Lord in all caps, Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens poured, the clouds indeed poured water, the mountains quaked before Yahweh, the one of Sinai, before Yahweh, the God of Israel. So Yahweh lives in Sinai, which is a mountain in the middle of nowhere, and apparently in Seir or Edom, these desert areas to the south of Israel. And Yahweh marches. Yahweh's a commuter God. Yahweh has to come to work in the morning from the wilderness to hang out in Israel and help the Israelites, and then go home to the wilderness areas. This is really important here, that Yahweh is associating with some of these properties of the wilderness. And Yahweh seems unafraid to bring the people through the wilderness, the 40 years. And by the way, 40 is kind of a round number in the ancient world. It just kind of means about that long.
Like a whole time, right? Like 40 years is like a whole generation.
Right. In the book of Judges, they often say this judge ruled for 40 years. And what we know of ancient kind of counting and so on is when they don't know a specific number, they give you a round number. And one of the big round numbers they give you in the Bible is 40. So that is reigned 40 days and 40 nights. What they're saying is roundabout, right? About that long, about a month, or 40 years, about a generation. That's what they mean. So in any event, there's this 40 years of wandering in the wilderness where Yahweh is with them and giving them food and providing support for them. And then there's 40 days that Moses is on the mountain in Sinai receiving the law. This is in Exodus 19, 20, and so on. And then you've got 40 days that Elijah in 1 Kings 19 is kind of in the wilderness looking for God, and trying to find God. So you want to find God, you can go to the temple in Jerusalem, but really you got to go in the wilderness to find Yahweh. So all to say, there's some stuff that we got to dive dive into here. But Hagar, by the way, is someone who is in the wilderness, left for dead in Genesis. She's an enslaved person, an Egyptian who's enslaved by Abram and Sarah, is left for dead in the wilderness because she's a threat, or perceived to be a threat to the lineage. And God meets her there and provides for her in the wilderness. So all to say, God's provision, God meeting you places, but also there's this terrible danger that the Bible never says it's a safe place. And in fact, when we talk, what we see in the New Testament is that it's associated with Jesus, with spiritual direction and growth, but also with terrible danger. So yeah, what do you see with that?
Yeah, I mean, I take away so much from that. I love the idea of a commuter God, and God commuting to Israel from the wilderness. I think the thing that strikes me most is how the description of God as living occurs more in the Bible than perhaps holy. We can check it later, statistics, but that God's quality as living it suggests that God is, and even the name of God, God will be who God will be, really matches with this wilderness God, that this is a God of power, the clouds and the mountains shaking, the earth quaking, all of these, talk about God's power, but also God's danger, God's unpredictability, God's unwillingness to be sort of housed in whatever way we might house God. And I think that that's really important. And thanks for tying it directly to the theme of Lent, because I don't think that that's what I would think about normally during Lent, is about God being living and active and on the move, and perhaps unpredictable and perhaps not safe. I feel like I've said this line 1,000 times now, but what you just said reminds me of C.S. Lewis's famous line of Aslan, that is Aslan safe? And it's no, God, no. Aslan is not safe, but Aslan is good. And the degree to which we put God into a metaphorical palace, a metaphorical temple, and say, God, when I need you, I'll come to you on my terms. And that so much of this wilderness tradition suggests that God is always able to break out of those temples, those palaces, those cages that we put God into, and leads us ever to new places. And so with this study, with this Lent, that's one of my hopes, right? One of my hopes. I think one of the hopes of this study has always been that God shows up in the wilderness, that God shows up in pandemic time, that God shows up in social distancing, perhaps not in the ways that we want or expect, but that God does in fact show up, that God is in fact living and active. And so I love that. I think that's tremendous, and I think it sheds light on the temptation narrative from the Gospels that we see, and I think if we,
and we can make a very direct segue, which is that when the people are in exile in Babylon, the first message that they're going to come home is Isaiah chapter 40, which tells the people of Jerusalem who've been taken into exile, I'm going to make a wilderness highway for you to take you directly home, because we wouldn't go through the wilderness from Babylon to Israel. If you were going from Babylon to Israel, you would move along the Euphrates River, which would take you far north, and then you come down the seacoast so that you would always be near water. But in Isaiah chapter 40, it says, "Comfort, oh comfort my people." Right? Says your God. So this is that kind of famous bit. You can maybe hear Handel's Messiah going on in the background, right? But raise every valley and bring down every mountaintop. We're going to build this flat highway through the wilderness so that you can get home as quick as possible. This is a message of hope and restoration to people, but it's also going through the wilderness. And the idea is that God is okay going through the wilderness, even when the armies of Babylon aren't. But that also is picked up then in the beginning of the Gospels, right?
Right. Yeah. So in particular, it's picked up in our earliest gospel right at the beginning as the identification of John the Baptist as the one who is in the wilderness crying out, "Prepare the way of the Lord." And of course,
that's Mark chapter 1. Yep.
That's Mark 1. We could probably say more about John the Baptist as also somebody who, as the prophet of the Lord, shows up in uninhabitable places, outside of civilization, outside of sort of I would say probably parallel to or adjacent to sort of official rites of Jewish religious life. So he's not at least according to Mark, he's not necessarily a priest. He's not a Pharisee. He's not maybe a Sadducee. He sort of is critical of that. He's critical of the church and state relationship that he sees at play, so much so, he's critical of the rulers, but he's sort of adjacent to the establishment, to the religious establishment of the day.
He's a bit of a chaos monster, John the Baptist.
He is. I mean, he's shaking it up.
There's some danger and repentance, right? He's asking for transformation, and he's also threatening in a way.
Yeah, well, and again, the degree to which your comments at the beginning are just so illuminating. But repentance in Greek is metanoeo, to transform your thinking. And again, I think about if chaos monsters are those things that disrupt and undo that which is established, then repentance really is what a chaos monster would encourage us to do is, to bring about chaos. In the biblical sense, it's always toward an alignment with God. It's always towards, getting your life in line with the life of God. But that's a destabilizing sort of thing. So we have the Gospel of Mark, our earliest gospel, opens up with this quotation from Isaiah about the wilderness. We got John the Baptizer and this crazy description of him. He's got camel's hair. He's got a leather belt. He eats locusts and wild honey. I mean, he's a wilderness person. And he represents that wilderness. And then sort of the next stage in the Jesus story is the baptism of Jesus at the Jordan. Again, a place outside of what we would call outside of the temple, outside of the synagogue. It's not a part of the established religious traditions. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's trying to replace them or counteract them, but it's important for us to note that it's adjacent or parallel to them. And of course, we all remember the baptism story that, Jesus is baptized, and at least in Mark's gospel, the heavens are said to sort of get ripped open, and there's something like a dove that descends upon Jesus. And there's a heavenly voice that says, "You are my beloved, and with you I'm well pleased." And the three different synoptic gospels tell these opening stories in slightly different ways. In Mark's gospel, it seems that only Jesus hears this. In Matthew and Luke, it becomes more obvious that maybe those around also heard it. But what is clear in all three of these gospels is that right after the baptism, Jesus is driven into the wilderness. And Mark's account is the shortest. It says, "And the Spirit immediately drove him into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him." That's just Mark 1:12 through 13. It is very brief, but it's very clear. What we see is that the purpose of this is to be tempted in the wilderness, and that he's with the wild beasts, which again suggests to me some of this danger, the uninhabitable, it's unpredictable. And then there's this funny line in 13, and the angels, they waited on him. I think in Matthew's gospel, it gets a little bit clearer. It's like after the temptation, the angels come and sort of like attend to Jesus. They give him attention. But in Mark, it's perhaps a little bit more ambiguous. And so that's our earliest account. Mark's is, again, by most New Testament scholars' perspective, the first of the Gospels that was written, and then Matthew and Luke sort of reuse and edit and add to the Gospel account that we find in Mark. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how Luke tells the story in Luke chapter 4. The biggest difference is between Mark, our earliest, and Luke and Matthew is both Matthew and Luke tell us what sorts of things were happening in this temptation. Mm-hmm. They tell us the sorts of the means of the temptation, and it seems as though the temptations are like this. For those Baptists that are watching, it's like it's a sword drill war. It's, who can quote scripture better than the other. And Satan sort of approaches Jesus with a piece of scripture or full quotation. And then Jesus responds with his own sort of set of scripture. And again, there's a different order in Matthew and Luke, but in Luke, the order is, Jesus, you must be really, really hungry. So why don't you turn stone into bread? And Jesus responds, man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that flows from the mouth of God, sort of saying, I don't need to do that. But it's maybe a temptation to turn, to take care of his own physical need. The next is, takes Jesus up and says, all of these kingdoms can be yours if you'll just bow down and worship me. And Jesus says you should only, a good old Exodus and Deuteronomistic guy says you can only worship Yahweh, only the God of Israel.
Right. Jesus loves Deuteronomy. It's good to know.
He does. It's good to know. And then the final temptation is, Jesus is taken up to this pinnacle of the temple, and Satan says, you know what? God promised that he would look after you. God promised that he would protect you. So why don't you just commit suicide? Why don't you throw yourself down and the angels will catch you? And this is where Jesus says, don't test the Lord your God. You're not allowed to test God. And at that point, Satan disappears. The angels show up, and that's sort of the end of the story. So there's been libraries written, I'm sure, about the significance of these temptations. I'm sure that you could build a whole Lent study about, 2 weeks on each of the 3 temptations, and, how are you tempted to take care of your own needs, and how are you tempted by power and prestige, and how are you tempted with the miraculous? So they're fantastic. But again, it seems to be drawing on some of this wilderness material, the 40 days, for example, of Moses and Elijah, but also, Jesus is met by the Holy Spirit, actually is, according to Luke 4:1, is led. The Holy Spirit sort of compels Jesus into this place. So that wilderness experience is not accidental, it's intentional, even if it entails some danger and some risk and some discomfort. So those are sort of just my thoughts about Luke 4, 1 through 13, but I'm sure that you have some thoughts as well, and some ways that it interacts with what you've said about the wilderness already.
Yeah, again, it's a place of threat. It's a place that's inhabited by demons. That's what Luke 4 says. Now, the Old Testament doesn't really talk about demons very much, and I'll explain that more next week. We'll talk about that. There. Why is it that when you read the Old Testament, you don't read about demons, but then you read the New? Well, there's a couple of mentions, like Azazel, or some weird stuff in Leviticus, right? The Day of Atonement. But there's not much about demons in the Old Testament. The New Testament's full of them. So what happened, right? Yeah. There's a story to tell there, and we'll take time to tell that next time. But just to say, the wilderness is inhabited by forces of chaos and evil, which can be destructive to people and can kill people and so on. But at the same time, can be in some way liberating. There's some kind of power to it too. And so it's interesting. You were talking about the temple. That God doesn't hate the temple. In 2 Samuel 7, when God says, "I prefer to sleep in a tent," God doesn't say, "I hate the temple. I can't wait to tear it down, and don't build it because I don't want to be living in a big palace." But does seem to be something seductive in a bad way about things that are too cushy. This is a theme that comes up throughout the Bible, is that it's not that the things are bad in and of themselves, because there are a lot of Christians say we're going to give up any anything that's nice. If it tastes nice, if it smells nice, like I want to sit in a bed of nails for my life, and I don't deserve anything good because I'm a terrible person and I'm awful. We're not saying that. In the Old Testament, it doesn't say that. In fact, there's not a lot of like asceticism, like we talk, like just like rejecting nice things because nice things are bad. Instead, there's a lot of suspicion that getting too cozy and comfy, it makes it difficult for you to focus. It takes away your mission. It takes away your spark, your spiritual hunger, let's say, to follow God and to do what God wants. There's a temptation there. So it's not that Pharaoh is a bad guy in and of himself. God gives a lot of time and a lot of effort to try to convince Pharaoh, right? But in the end, Pharaoh is so overwhelmed by these forces of his own comfort that he's willing to keep other people enslaved to keep that machine running. So what from the outside looks like the biggest place in the world, right? The place that builds the pyramids. It's the most advanced in terms of culture and science and technology, and in the Middle Bronze Age, they have huge population. Everything seems ordered and well run in the Egyptian kingdom from the outside, right? But at the exact same time, it's built on a foundation of dominating other people and taking advantage of them. And this is the thing that Yahweh is undoing. What looks like chaos from the outside, tearing down this large, powerful structure of Egyptian, power, is in fact trying to get the people to understand and release people who have been subjugated and oppressed in order to keep the machine running. And it's almost like Pharaoh, like there's this, God imagines that Pharaoh is going to kind of let go, but then also God hardens Pharaoh's heart and Pharaoh hardens his own heart. So there's a very tense struggle throughout that book, and it's complicated. But there's it's not that Yahweh hates temples, hates cities, hates nice things, nice food. You should fast because you shouldn't like food or something. It's Valentine's today. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. It's okay. I know that Valentine wasn't really a guy about love. He loved Jesus and was martyred for that sake. But at the same time, it's okay to eat chocolate and love God and be romantic. It's okay, right? But there's always a temptation in having too much, right? In kind of being too at home with yourself, or too self-reliant, too proud of your own achievements or whatever. It's not that being proud is bad, but you don't want to become Pharaoh, right? That you're so full of yourself and every need is taken care of, and you have all the pleasures of life, so that you forget what it's like for most people out there. You forget where your stuff comes from, and you detach yourself from the world, the other people in it, and from God. And so a lot of times what looks like destabilization, this is why I think Jerusalem falls too. And Jesus doesn't, God doesn't hate Jerusalem. In the Old Testament period, when Jerusalem falls and the people are taken into the exile, God spends years and centuries even pleading with them, please change, please. If you read the book of Jeremiah, God is crying. God says, I am crying tears as I start to unbuild Jerusalem. But they gave me no choice, because for centuries I've been asking them to care for the orphan and the widow and for the alien, and they didn't. This Jeremiah 7 says this, and Jeremiah 22. It's kind of all throughout the book of this refrain of Jeremiah. You didn't do these things. You built your society, and now you became Pharaoh, and I'm going to have to unbuild this system that's been built. And that kind of unbuilding is itself chaotic. It's wilderness space, and the people go into the wilderness. But Jeremiah writes a letter to them, Jeremiah 29. If everyone knows one verse from Jeremiah, it's Jeremiah 29:11, right?
Yep.
Yeah, but the thing is, that letter is written that, I know I have plans for you, God says, plans to prosper you, right? But that's a letter written to people who are going into exile, who are going to die in exile.
Yeah.
They're never coming home. Their kids might come home, their grandkids might come home, but they're going to die in exile. And Jeremiah is writing them that letter. And he says, you're going to live in Babylon. It's going to be okay there. You're going to plant gardens, and you're going to have families, and you're going to have a life. It's going to be a good life. And you should pray for Babylon while you're there. This destabilizing gives a chance for things to regrow, or Jeremiah says, I've been called to pull up, but also to plant. But the planting has to come after the pulling up.
Right.
So we can think of this kind of season of wilderness as a season that can be traumatic, terrible, evil, but at the same time, giving a space. This kind of chaos, this disruption can give a space for things to grow that need to grow, or for us to refocus, or to see what things were kind of keeping us from our love for God and our love for neighbor. I don't know if that connects at all, Chris, but that's kind of what I see in the Temptations. Yeah.
I know, I love it. It almost feels unnecessary or even uncouth to say that the last year has been destabilizing.
Right.
I'm sure you get a lot of the same emails that I get about the ways in which the pandemic has forever altered what church is going to look like, and what it means to be in Christian community together, both positively and negatively. The fact that we're doing this Bible study and that we have people in Atlanta, but some, in Washington State, and some, in Maryland and Pennsylvania who are joining us either live or throughout the week is, again, that's a product of this wilderness experience. That there is a cycle of birth and new birth and death. Some things, little deaths is sometimes the way that we hear people talk about it. And so, the fact that, even the fact that the declaration that Jesus is God's beloved, is followed up not with, here's a cushy couch, or, here's a really powerful throne or seat, but, your identity is beloved, but you're still thrown into the wilderness. And that for, what you said about Jeremiah and the exile, Israel is still God's chosen people. God cries for them. And yet there is this reality of exile, of wilderness, and so true in the story of Jesus, that declaration of beloved is, almost immediately followed by this trial, where that belovedness, if we're fair, is going to be tested. And I think one of the things that you and I have tried to give voice to in this study is lament. God, Jesus is triumphant in the end in Luke 4. What we're not given is a lot of his interior struggle in the 40 days leading up to that struggle and the ultimate showdown. And so I think that
we don't have a sense that he was stoically not responding to it, in part because in the Gospels, during the Passion, Jesus suffers. He's hurt. He cries out in pain. He cries out in astonishment about what's happening, and so on. He is deeply hurt by the abandonment that he feels from God and from his friends and his family. So all to say, we do get the sense that Jesus does have an interior life. It's not mentioned here in Luke 4, but Jesus wasn't just stoically accepting all of the temptations and dangers of the wilderness. He was hurting. This is why this actually was, when Jesus is struggling with the devil over these temptations, the idea is that these were incredibly tempting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. If you're starving, a rock might look like a cheeseburger as it is, without miraculous intervention. But yeah, no, I think that's right. And this is probably, I think as we prepare for this Lenten journey, I think about what Paul has made popular, but may have been earlier than Paul, this idea that we are baptized into Christ. And so that the declaration of beloved that's our identity as well, because we've been baptized into the body of Christ, that we are members of that. And so that declaration of belovedness also comes on us in this Lent, even as we find ourselves in some form of wilderness or another. And I think that's a challenge and a good word. And in many ways, as we advance in this study and we think about Jesus, and in some ways we're also thinking about Jesus followers, and if we're engrafted, if we are part of that beloved, then some of what our study is going to say about Jesus and the cross, or Jesus and the powers and principalities, is also part of the vocation of the Christian. Not that we replace God or replace Jesus, but that we are commissioned to share in that lot.
And speaking of that, so right after Luke 4, right after the temptation in the wilderness, Jesus then is filled with the Spirit, goes to Galilee, and begins teaching. And then you get the content of that teaching, which is from Isaiah, which is from the same part of Isaiah. It comes right after the part about the wilderness, like they've been brought home out of exile and so on. And Jesus talks about his commissioning, and he, not in a way that says like, it's just about me, but it's about kind of a, he's claiming this thing that Isaiah once, there was second Isaiah, third Isaiah, said about that prophet. And now that Jesus is claiming for himself, and in a way saying this is about us too, right? So the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and let the oppressed go free. By the way, that's all chaos monster activity from the perspective of the people who are in power over the top of the oppressed, and the people who are profiting off of them, and the people who are keeping the captives captive, right? Like those. This is an overturning. Babylon, letting go the Israelites to go to Jerusalem, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to go back home and rebuild Jerusalem. That's because Cyrus, the Persian king, overturned Babylon. So all to say that this overturning, can be a terrible thing and a good thing all at once, all from different perspectives. And part of it is just to ask, like, to not say this is either good or bad, but to say, can I recognize the evil in this moment that's not God? Like Satan's in the wilderness tempting, right? This is not God, and this is not good. But also, can I recognize the parts of this that are God and are good? That might look like chaos, right? And it's not just order versus chaos. It's the chaos is sometimes bad, and the chaos is sometimes good, and the order is sometimes bad, the order is sometimes good. But part of the wilderness and taking things away from ourselves, this kind of Lenten journey that people go on, part of it is to try to recognize, right? Give ourselves the space to recognize what is good. What is God doing in my life? What is the chaos that's from God, and what's the chaos that's not? What looks like order to me, but is actually bad, right? And what looks like order to me that's my own idol, right? So I think that's part of what I appreciate about Lent. But it can be, obviously, if it becomes self-punishment because we hate ourselves, that's not what we're looking for in Lent. But I think that sometimes we stay away from that. We stay away from any of the positives of Lent, the positive potentials in Lent, because we worry too much about keeping things from us because we hate ourselves. I think there's a balance to be out there.
The guilt quotient.
Yeah.
So what if I was to take one takeaway from our conversation this morning? It sounds like, if there's an exhortation, it is to embrace God as chaos monster. And it seems like, go get your beloved a stuffed animal, and you can give it to them as their own little chaos monster to remind them of God's work in chaos. And I love the exhortation about discernment, and it's not always clear. There's an ambiguity to the chaos in our lives. But for those that have eyes to see and ears to hear, we can discern what God is up to and how God is working. I think that's super powerful and really important. Yeah. So I'm looking at the time. We have about 4 more minutes. I think we can sort of wrap up our time for today. So next week, we've already sort of gestured towards this a little bit. We are going to be talking, the topic is Jesus and the forces of evil. And I'm going to just on Facebook and in our Zoom chat real quick, I'm going to go ahead and put in the primary text that we're looking at. Again, these are available on the Mighty Network, but these are just a sampling, and they're all from the Gospel of Mark, or from the early chapters of the Gospel of Mark. But then I've put together a sampling of some early Jewish reflections on evil. As Brennan noted, if you're looking for demons and even Satan as like a personification of evil in the Old Testament, you have to search pretty hard. And then you open up the pages of the New Testament and you're like, wait, demons? Jesus, there's impure spirits. You get to Revelation. It's like this whole like good angels and bad angels. And it can be really destabilizing to think, how did we get here? How do we get from idols who are, sort of weak and insignificant in the Old Testament to these like superpower demons in Revelation? And our hope is to sort of dig a little bit into that and give a little bit of a orientation to that.
Yeah, great. It's a story. It's a historical trajectory. People today don't have all the answers figured out. That is to say, even today there are mysteries to us about who God is and how Jesus works with the Trinity. And so, there remain mysteries today for us, just like there were mysteries in the ancient world. Not all mysteries are the same. So we're going to talk about how people in ancient Israel understood evil, and we're going to talk about Leviticus. And I'm going to try to make Leviticus interesting for you. So see if that works. But we'll tell a little story, and then we'll kind of breach the gap between the testaments.
Right.
And we'll mention Daniel 12 as well, one of the strangest chapters in the Bible.
All right. Cannot wait. But thank you. Thanks y'all for joining us on Facebook, joining us on the webinar. And we look forward to hearing from you. Join the Mighty Network, and we'll be back next week at 9:30 again. Sorry for the confusion on the time, time, but next 9:30 on Facebook Live or Zoom. Thanks a lot, Brennan.
Thank you, Chris. Peace, y'all.
Peace.